Hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah. Good morning. Bonjour. Khawateen wa Hazarat, Assalamu alaikum. Distinguished guests on the dais and friends, ladies and gentlemen. I am not an expert on the domain. To tell you a secret, I am an expert on no domain. But I am going to talk about this subject of this session. I will divide my short remark in 3 capsules. The first one is a quick brief on Asia, what it is. The second one is a quick brief on Africa, what it is. And the third is the subject that we will address. What do we do as 2 continents who are, as of now, the largest in terms of population, to address the issue of climate change? The first capsule is Asia. 2 countries which are very, very important in Asia are India and China. Of course, we also have Japan and South Korea and many other countries. There are 49 of them in Asia. And these countries have all their history. For a very long time in the West, India was considered a backward country. And it was believed that it is the Hindu dharma which has kept them backwards. Something wrong with their religion. Somehow, in the beginning of this century, there were reports coming out of the West. Some PhD students, like some of you, came out with this theory that India and China were prosperous countries once upon a time. And they have been reduced to what they are today by colonization. So, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, decided that we should study this subject. What is wrong? So they got hold of a large number of economists and appointed a leader called Professor Angus Maddison. Professor Angus Maddison and his team did a study on the history of the GDP of the world. History of the GDP of the world. Then they realized that for the first 1,500 years of the Christian era, year 1 AD to 1500 AD, the largest economy in the world was India. And it accounted for 34% of the global output. And the second largest economy in the world was China, which 24% contribution to the global economic output. Even in 1757, the first battle of the British Empire, fought by Robert Clive and the East India Company, the British East India Company, fought a war with the Nawab of Bengal in India, who was helped by his French allies. That was in 1757. That year, the contribution of the Indian economy to the global economy was still 24.5%. Anyway, after that, we have 200 years of British rule, direct or indirect, and now in 1947, when we became independent, we had come down to 1.7% of the global output. The same thing happened to the Chinese. The British bought cheap opium from India, went and sold it there in China, and in return bought Chinese tea, Chinese porcelain, Chinese silk, Chinese muslin, and then went and sold it in Europe for a hefty margin and an astronomical price. So Japan was also subjugated by colonies, and it was also subjugated by Japan, another Asian country which colonized China. But things have now changed. Today, they have tried to reclaim their positions, India and China, in the Committee of Nations. The Chinese have already reached 17.8 trillion GDP. India is just about racing to reach $4 trillion of GDP. But between the two of them, we have a large component of climate change. This is about Asia. Now come to Africa. Africa has been in existence for a very long time. Human race has evolved from Africa. Most of the people forget that it is a fact. It's only Hariri, Noah Hariri, when he wrote his book, History of Humankind, then only many of the people started realizing. Africa is what now? It's about 30.3 million square kilometers of land, a little smaller than Asia. Asia is 44 million square kilometers. Asia has a population of 4.8 billion today, and Africa has a population of 1.5 billion. Now, Asia is contributing $29 trillion to the global economic output. What are the global GDP, if anybody remembers? It's $105 trillion today. And Asia contributes $29 trillion out of that. Of course, 17 is Chinese contribution. The rest of it is India, Japan, South Korea, everybody and his brother. And in the case of Africa, it was not that out of the blue it has become poor. It became poor because of a reason. This continent, which was the richest even today in terms of resources, more than 30% of the mineral and natural resources of this globe are still in Africa after relentless exploitation by the West for centuries. That continent is still rich. So still people want to exploit this continent. If you go back to the history of Africa, there's one event which stands straight, it stands and stares at you. That is, during the years 1526 to 1689, 12.5 million able-bodied African men and women were transported like sardines in a fish can, like slaves, with neck-to-neck chains and feet-to-feet chains across the Atlantic Ocean into Europe and the United States of America. What is the significance of this? In that period of time, the population of Africa varied between 60 to 70 million. 12.5 million of them were chained and transported across the Atlantic Sea. If somebody gives a lecture to the Africans about human rights violations, they should be reminded of this story of slave trade. And this exploitation has continued. Today, although the population is 1.5 billion and they are accommodated themselves in 30 million square kilometers, and they account for 18% of the population of the world, they do no damage to the environment. There is nothing that is happening. The only contribution to the climate destruction or climate change negative impact from Africa is 4%. And that of entire Asia is 39%. So 39 plus 4, that's about 43% of the damage that is taking place because of Asia and Africa. But this is not cumulative, this is today's. If you go for the cumulative destruction that has been carried out, it will all go to the Western world. This is another aspect that we have to take into account. So Africa is another continent which is the future, because today 1 out of every 6 is an African. In 2050, 1 out of 4 will be an African, and in 2100, every second person will be an African. So the median age of Asia is 32.6 years. That means half the population is below 32.6, the other half is above 32.6. And the population of the world at large, the median age is 30.6. So 30.6 years, half the population is below it and the other half is above it. What is the median age of Africa? It's 19 years. Just 19 years, literally half, close to half of either Asia or the whole world. So this is the continent which has a long way to go. And this is why I call it the continent of the future. Now come to the third capsule that I was talking about, the subject of this conference. How much contribution has Africa and Asia have made to climate destruction? In the year 2022, according to United Nations Environment Program, the total carbon emission, greenhouse gases which were emitted by the globe was 52.7 billion metric tons. Out of this, Africa is less than 4%, Asia is 39%, and the rest of the world is communicating with the rest of it. How do we address it? Should we do anything at all? First, let us talk about what we can do ourselves. Because they say even God helps those who help themselves. Is there anything that is not available in Asia which is available in the West? Of course, a lot of things are available within us. Technology. There is no technology in renewable energy which is not available in China and India. Why do you have to go beg the West? You can do it yourself. Number one suggestion. Number two, sustainable agriculture. If there is anyone who knows about agriculture, it is Asia. Today, we have done enough work on it and we have enough experience about it. We don't need